Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. That is the date in your textbook. That is the date on the timeline. That is the answer you would give on a history exam and get full marks. But there are maps, real maps, physically surviving maps that are sitting in museums right now, drawn in 1513 and 1531, that show Antarctica in precise detail. Not a vague guess at a southern landmass, not a philosophical blob drawn to balance out the north. A detailed, accurate, charted coastline with river systems, mountain ranges, and internal geographic features that humanity did not technologically confirm existed until the 1950s using sonar. Let me say that one more time so it lands properly. A map drawn in 1531 shows geographic features of Antarctica that we could not verify until scientists pointed mid-20th century sonar equipment at the rock beneath 2 miles of ice. And in the same decade that sonar confirmed what was under that ice, 50 nations signed a treaty locking Antarctica away from independent human access and have maintained that agreement consistently for decades. The date is 1820. The maps say otherwise. The silence around those maps is deafening. And once you start pulling this thread, it does not stop. Stay with me until the end of this video because what you're about to hear is not a theory someone posted online. It is a pattern built from dates, maps, expeditions, and silences that have been sitting in the historical record for centuries waiting to be connected. Welcome back. Everything in this video is traceable, every date is real, every map exists, every expedition happened. What I am offering you is not an answer. It is a question. A very specific, very carefully constructed question that the official record has never satisfyingly addressed. So let us start at the beginning, or rather, let us start at what they tell us is the beginning. 3 separate expeditions from 3 separate nations, Britain, America, and Russia, all operating independently, we are told, all reached the same region, all within months of each other, all in the same year, and all claim sighting of Antarctica simultaneously. Now, exploration is competitive, expeditions do overlap, nations race toward discovery. I understand all of that, and I am not dismissing it, but I want to ask a different kind of question, not whether it happened, but why then? Why, after millennia of sophisticated human civilization, after the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and every advanced maritime culture that ever put a hole to open water, why does the largest landmass south of the equator remain entirely undiscovered, undocumented, and unnamed until 1820? Why then specifically? What changed? And the answer to that question, when you actually dig for it, leads somewhere that the standard historical narrative has never wanted to go. Because 1820 is not just a year. It is 4 years after 1816, and 1816 is the year the sky went dark. The official story of 1816 is the year without a summer. Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in 1815. It ejected enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to lower global temperatures measurably. Harvests failed across the northern hemisphere. Snow fell in June across New England and northern Europe. Livestock died. Famine spread. Orange and purple sunsets were reported across multiple continents simultaneously. The explanation is tidy. The timeline is clean. One volcano, global consequences, move on. But here's what the official account struggles to fully explain. The uniformity, the sheer continent-spanning, simultaneous scale of the collapse. Crop failures were not regional, they were global. The cold was not clustered near Indonesia. It was everywhere at once. And not just environmentally, socially, politically. The years immediately following 1816 saw institutional ruptures, mass population displacements, and what researchers have described as civilizational amnesia. Entire communities appear to lose continuity with what came before them. Something broke in 1816, something enormous. And 4 years later, the world's most remote, most inaccessible, most sealed frozen landmass is suddenly officially entered into the record, simultaneously, by 3 nations at once. Now hold that timing alongside what the maps show. Because this is where the official story does not just crack, it collapses. The Piri Reis map, dated 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who explicitly stated in his own notes that he compiled it from older source maps. Maps he does not name, maps that have never been located, maps whose origin he describes but does not explain. This map shows a southern landmass, not a philosophical guess, not a symmetrical smear of ink added for visual balance, a detailed coastline. And when researchers in the 20th century overlaid that coastline against modern satellite imaging of the subglacial terrain beneath the Antarctic ice, the actual rock surface hidden under 2 miles of frozen water, the alignment was precise enough to stop people in their tracks. Not perfect, but far too accurate to be coincidence, far too specific to be guesswork. Someone drew that coastline from observation, from knowledge, from first-hand experience, or from maps made by people who had first-hand experience. The Orontius Finaeus map from 1531 goes even further. It depicts Antarctica without ice. with river systems, with mountain ranges, with internal geographic features showing a landmass that was ice-free and in enough detail that someone had to have been there, had to have mapped it, had to have recorded what they saw. And those features, the rivers, the mountains, the coastal configurations, were not confirmed by modern science until the 1950s, when sonar technology was finally advanced enough to look through 2 miles of ice and see what was underneath. The academic response to these maps has historically been one of 3 things: coincidence, lucky extrapolation, or the suggestion that ancient cartographers were guessing at a southern landmass for philosophical reasons, the idea that the north must be balanced by the south, so they drew something to fill the space. And maybe there is some truth to that. Maybe early cartographers did speculate. But you cannot speculate a river. You cannot philosophically extrapolate subglacial mountain ridges that match sonar data 5 centuries later. You cannot guess a coastline with enough accuracy that it survives comparison against satellite imaging. You observe that. You record that. You inherit that from someone who was there. And that raises the question that sits at the center of everything we are discussing today. Who was there and when? Because the Piri Reis map is 1513, the Orontius Finaeus map is 1531, and those maps were compiled from older sources, which means the knowledge of an ice-free, geographically detailed Antarctica predates 1513. By how much? The Admiral says older maps. He does not say how old. The chain of hands that preserved that knowledge across time, across whatever catastrophe separated the world that produced it from the world that inherited it, that chain is unbroken but unnamed. Now bring in the architecture problem. Because Antarctica does not exist in isolation from the broader pattern we have been tracing across this series, across the historical record, there's a category of evidence that the official timeline cannot account for. Buildings that appear fully constructed without any preceding construction phases, civic infrastructure in cities supposedly founded in the early 19th century that would have required decades of labor and resources that brand new frontier settlements simply did not have. Cathedrals in frontier towns. Elaborate sewer systems installed in cities that were by official record wilderness 5 years before the systems were put in. Streets running above ground floors of buildings whose windows begin below current street level because either the street level rose or something came down and covered what was already standing. This pattern repeats across North America, across Europe, across Russia, across South America. It is not regional. It is not isolated. It is global. And every time it surfaces, the official explanation involves dismissal or vague hand-waving that dissolves the moment you actually look at the evidence directly. The transition periods are missing. The documentation is thin. The workforces that supposedly built these structures are unaccounted for. The supply chains do not exist. The timelines do not work. Something was already there. And across this series, we have been building toward a provisional name for the civilization that left those structures, Tartaria. Not an empire in the conventional sense. Not a country with borders on a modern map. Something harder to define, but increasingly impossible to ignore. A presence, a civilization whose fingerprints are visible in the architecture, in the canal systems, in the city grids that appear fully formed in the historical record without any scaffolding period, without any of the messy incremental archaeology that should accompany genuine human settlement, and then apparently simply gone, erased or reset. And 1816 may have been the reset. The atmospheric event of 1816, whatever its true cause, functions in this framework not just as a volcanic aftermath, but as the terminal convulsion of something. The kind of collapse so total that it left atmospheric scars across the northern hemisphere and civilizational amnesia across entire communities. A reset that ended one world and quietly allowed another to be built in its place, using the infrastructure already standing, inheriting the architecture without inheriting the explanation for it, 4 years after that reset. 1820. Antarctica, officially discovered, officially named, officially entered into the record. Now stay with the timeline because it does not stop there. In 1938, 7 years before the end of World War II, Nazi Germany launched the Schwabenland expedition to Antarctica. They mapped nearly 600,000 square kilometers of territory. They dropped thousands of marker stakes to assert territorial claim, and they reportedly returned with something that shifted internal priorities at the highest levels of the Nazi scientific apparatus, whose known documented obsessions included ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, prehistoric advanced cultures, and inherited cartographic traditions that supposedly predated the modern world. The same maps, the same thread. What they found has never been fully disclosed. The records are incomplete in the specific way that records tend to be when the answer matters. German submarines were documented operating in Antarctic waters as late as 1945. That is a documented fact, not a speculation. Submarines at the bottom of the world in the final months of the war. And then, 1 year after the war ended in 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump. led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific mapping and establishing a research base. But this was not a research team. It was 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 military personnel. That is not a science expedition. That is an expeditionary force. And the timing, 1 year after Nazi Germany's known interest and presence in Antarctica ends, raises questions that the official scientific mapping explanation has never fully quieted. What was everyone looking for? What did the maps promise? What did Schwabenland find that made the United States mobilize 5,000 military personnel within a year of Germany's defeat? We are not told. And then in 1959, 13 years after Operation High Jump, 50 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. It designated Antarctica as a scientific preserve. It explicitly prohibited military activity on the continent, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing. And in practice, it made independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior essentially impossible. Not illegal in a straightforward and forcible sense, just practically unreachable. You need logistical support that only governments and large institutions can provide. You need permissions that are quietly difficult to obtain for anything outside approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that simply does not exist for the independent traveler. The result is that Antarctica is functionally the one place on Earth that an ordinary person in the 21st century cannot simply go and look around. Every other landmass on the planet, every mountain range, every jungle, every desert, every remote island can be accessed by a motivated individual with enough resources and determination. People climb Everest recreationally. People cross the Sahara alone. People sail to the most remote Pacific islands with nothing but a small boat. But Antarctica has a treaty. 50 nations agreed. In the same decade that sonar technology first confirmed what was hiding under the ice. And here is the coordination problem that I cannot stop returning to. Nations do not agree on almost anything. The 20th century was practically defined by national disagreement, borders, resources, ideology, everything. And yet, on this, about this one frozen continent, 50 separate nations with competing interests and opposing ideologies all signed the same agreement and have maintained it consistently for decades. What is it about ice and penguins that requires that level of international consensus? What is it about this particular frozen landmass that made the Soviet Union and the United States, who were in 1959 pointed nuclear weapons at each other, find common ground? The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore the longer you sit with it. Now bring in the silence, because the silence is its own kind of evidence. There is no serious mainstream academic discussion of the Piri Reis map in introductory history curricula. It appears as a footnote, if it appears at all. There is no institutional inquiry into the coordination problem of 1820, 3 independent expeditions arriving simultaneously at an undiscovered continent. There is no academic curiosity about the gap between the ice-free maps of the 16th century and the frozen wasteland officially discovered in the 19th. There is no explanation for how, if Antarctica's ice built up over geological time the way we are told, human cartographers produced maps in historical time showing the ice-free terrain beneath it with sufficient accuracy to survive comparison against 20th century sonar data. Silence on this scale, across this many disciplines, maintained for this long, is not absence of evidence. It is a shape, and shapes mean something. Silence this consistent and this widespread does not happen by accident. It happens because institutions have decided what questions are worth asking and what questions are not, and this question has been placed firmly in the second category for reasons that have never been explained. Now ask the hardest question, the one that sits at the center of everything we have been building toward. What is under that ice? We know from the cartographic evidence that Antarctica was at some point in historical time a habitable landmass. Not geologically ancient, historically recent enough that human beings mapped it, recent enough that those maps survived into the 16th century, copied from even older sources. If a civilization of genuine sophistication existed before 1816, a civilization that built architecture without documentation, that had cartographic knowledge without acknowledged origin, that left infrastructure whose builders are unaccounted for across multiple continents simultaneously, then where was the center of that civilization? Where was its capital? Where was the place that held the records, the knowledge, the architecture that explained everything else? What if it was south? What if the ice-free continent visible on those older maps was not the edge of the old world, but its heart? What if what is buried under 2 miles of Antarctic ice right now is not just geological material, but the answer to the question that the rest of the evidence keeps pointing toward? I'm not claiming there are pyramids under the Antarctic ice sheet, though it is documented that structures in the Ellsworth Mountains have generated genuine academic debate about their geometry. I'm not claiming there is a lost city sealed under the Ross Ice Shelf. I'm asking why in 2026, with ground-penetrating radar capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with satellites that can read a license plate from orbit, with the full technological weight of the most advanced civilization in recorded history pointed at every corner of the Earth, the subglacial topography of Antarctica's interior remains largely unmapped at high resolution. Why do the gaps in the data cluster specifically in the interior? Why does the silence persist exactly where it matters most? Here's the shape of everything we have covered today. Ancient maps show Antarctica ice-free and in detail before 1513. Those maps were compiled from even older sources. The continent is officially discovered in 1820, 4 years after the most catastrophic atmospheric event in recorded history. 3 nations arrive simultaneously with no acknowledged coordination. Nazi Germany mounts a major territorial expedition in 1938 and returns with something that shifted priorities. The United States responds with a military force of 5,000 personnel 1 year after Germany's defeat. 50 nations sign a treaty in 1959 locking the continent away from independent access. In the same decade, sonar confirms what is underneath the ice. The subglacial interior remains incompletely mapped. The academic silence is total and consistent, and beneath 2 miles of frozen silence sits a landmass that someone mapped in historical time, and that no official account can explain. Maybe the treaty is exactly what it claims to be. Maybe the maps are coincidence. Maybe 1820 is simply when humanity's technology finally reached far enough south. Maybe all of it is exactly what the textbook says. Maybe. But the pattern of timing, the coordination, the silence, the maps, the expeditions, and the carefully maintained inaccessibility of the one place on Earth that the old cartographers knew about, and that official history says was discovered only yesterday, that pattern does not resolve into coincidence the longer you look at it. It resolves into something that was sealed, something that was deliberately placed just out of reach, and something that may still be waiting under the ice exactly where the maps said it would be. The date is 1820. The maps say otherwise, and I cannot stop thinking about what that means. I do not think you will be able to either. If this series is giving you something that other channels are not willing to touch, hit like right now. Subscribe so you do not miss where this goes next. Share this with someone who has never questioned 1820. And drop your theory in the comments below. What do you think is under that ice? What were 50 nations protecting? The comment section is open. I will see you in the next one.